Okay, welcome back after a coffee break at the Climate and Sustainability Risks and Opportunities Conference organized by the National Bank of Slovakia. The building sector has a significant impact on global emissions and is responsible for a significant portion of energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. To address the impact of the building sector on global emissions, it is important to focus on energy-efficient design, construction and operation of buildings, as well as the use of low-carbon energy sources. Overall, reducing emissions from the building sector will require a sustainable efforts over time. Slovakia has a great opportunity to reduce energy usage by renovating both its publicly but also privately owned buildings, as you have heard before in a panel discussion through Recovery and Resilience Plan. And what this will mean for the future and also other questions will be asked now during our next panel discussion, hosted by Deputy Governor of National Bank of Slovakia, Mr. Ľudovít Odor. And we have a little bit smaller panel this time, considering of two people, two guests, two participants. The first of them, Peter Robel. I'm going in English and it's sometimes difficult to switch to Slovak. Head of the board at Budovy pre budúcnosť. Good afternoon. And Norbert Kurila, advisor from the President Office. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Please take a seat and let's start our next panel discussion.
Thank you for coming back after the coffee break. It's getting harder and harder. And I would like to prove that the central bank is really resilient and is able to cope with all kinds of shocks, including a shock that the moderator was not able to come this time. So I was here, so I was asked to moderate this panel. And I'm really glad to do that because this panel is a bit different from the other ones in a sense that everybody can imagine what kind of measures we can adopt to have more efficient buildings and how to invest in net zero construction and so on. So we have a very nice panel, and please don't forget we also have a Slido where you can ask questions and the code is 072023. So if you have questions, please ask through Slido, and I will try to pick some questions for our distinguished guests. So let's start with a quite easy question for Norbert, because we heard in the morning that one of the objectives of the central bank should be leading by example. And I know that you have an initiative at Madam President's office, leading by example in the public sector. So would you be so kind to tell us some words about these projects and how can we learn from that experience?
Yeah, thank you very much and good afternoon to everyone. Happy to be here and thanks for organizing this very timely and important conference. So coming to the presidential palace itself, Madam President declared an ambitious goal to become the first public institution in Slovakia and very likely also the very first presidential office in the world to be climate neutral or net zero by 2030. This target was put forward actually 2 years ago. And this project, which we call Green Office 2030, becomes a flagship initiative led by Madam President in her current mandate. We wanted not only just talk about the actions, but we wanted to act That's why we are starting from ourselves, and we want to demonstrate that it is feasible, that for comparable amount of money, changing behavior and actually adjusting to trends, we can show and demonstrate that it's feasible, it's doable, and we want to also inform and actually motivate other actors, including both in public and private sector, to go the same journey as we started. Actually, it's a new approach because we are following evidence-based approach. We are working with data. We are working with the carbon calculator that we jointly created or prepared thanks to the Environmental Institute for Environmental Policy. We are now capable of informing also public on an annual basis about the progress. We have basically 5 main clusters or areas where we want to reduce the emissions or mitigate our carbon footprint. Basically, it's about mobility. It's about the buildings. We are going to talk about it in this panel for much longer. It's about energy production. It's about, number 4, about the offsetting mechanism, where we, in full honesty, cannot reduce with the operations and reconstruction of the buildings our emissions. Due to the air travel, we need to compensate through planting trees, etc. And in fifth cluster is the sort of top of or elements of everything, so to say, like promotion of green public procurement, banning the single-use plastics, presents, gift policies, and so on. And all these clusters are actually meaning some modernization and as well meeting our climate and energy objectives at the same time. So this flagship project now has 2 dimensions as well, because as I said in the beginning, we just don't want to be as an institution just green. We want others to follow, and we need to work with all stakeholders, mostly in the public sector, because there is a lot of and tons of money coming from EU structural and investment funds and through also various innovative instruments. So we need to spend them wisely and invest in the proper solutions. This led us to initiate another project, which is called Presidential Green Stamp. And Madam President will reward by herself, by her personal presence, those reconstructions of public buildings and later also private buildings that they would meet our green standard. So we actually created, through the help of external partners, a certification scheme which is very innovative, also in political terms, which is prepared for the public sector if they want to modernize and turn their institution into the green one. We have sort of instructions and ideas how to do that. So this is one. And the number 2, it's the project which is derived from the flagship project, and it's actually supporting the young generation, young climate leaders. We have started first climate leadership program in August last year, where we had more than 25 participants, young leaders, mostly from universities, that we are helping to develop skill sets, knowledge and actually capabilities to drive climate agenda wherever they work. So those are those 3 projects, and I will particularly devote myself in the later part to the Presidential Green Seal, which actually talks about green buildings, green renovation, sustainability, etc.
Thank you. So let's zoom in on the buildings themselves. And now I turn to Peter. What are the main obstacles to make our buildings more efficient? Because it seems that at least in the public sector it is not money, since tons of money are coming, as you said, from the EU, but definitely it is not an easy process. So how do you see?
So if you look at the buildings, with new buildings that are built these days, they are not such a big problem from climate perspective or energy efficiency perspective. We already have regulation and requirements that make new buildings very highly efficient. at least from energy consumption point of view. We are shifting more and more towards emissions, and more focus will be on emissions, but I think new buildings are not the kind of, the biggest problem that we have. The biggest problem is, of course, in existing buildings, because 80% or 90% of the buildings we have today will still be standing and serving its function in 2050, when we have the commitment to be climate neutral. And of course, the existing buildings have been built in Slovakia. Most of the majority of buildings have been built in 1960, 1990, in the period of these 30 years. That was the construction boom. And of course, they were built to standards that were developed even before that. So they were built, developed with the technologies and with the insight, scientific insight that was available back then, and also they were, developed respective to the climate conditions that we had back then, and also the energy prices, by the way. But this has all changed, and the climate conditions are changing a lot. So this is, creating a lot of challenges, and it is absolute. I think this is already an accepted notion that we need to renovate buildings. And coming back to your question, what are the biggest obstacles or the barriers? If you imagine that you own a building, be it a single-family home, or you are a director of an organization in a public building. Now imagine that you want to renovate it. It is, first of all, a very complex project. It is a very complex project, and households don't have the expertise or the experience. You do it once per lifetime. So how should you know it? Where should you learn it? And public institutions often lack the professional capacity. They don't have the people who have the kind of professional expertise to prepare renovation project and manage its execution to successful result. So that's one obstacle, the complexity. And the second very big obstacle or the barrier is that it requires a substantial upfront investment. You need to put a lot of money into the renovation upfront. Of course, the beauty of renovating buildings is that the money will come back, will return. The return on investment is, if not very quick, but very secure. So this is there. But it requires the upfront investment. Again, something that public institutions in Slovakia struggle with. We know that municipalities, say it very loud and very frequently, that they lack own budgets and are depending on, usually European funds, European sources of budgets, and a similar situation is with households, where the savings are not sufficient, and many households don't even are eligible for loans with their income condition and asset conditions. So the complexity and the financial burden are the two biggest obstacles, and that's why we need not only Slovakia but every country in the world, including the most developed countries in the world and the richest country in the world. We need public policies to help overcome these barriers, because renovating buildings is not only interest of the household or the public institution or a private company. It's a public interest, because buildings consume energy and because buildings generate emissions. By the way, and let me conclude with that to underline why it is so important in Slovakia. We all know that Slovakia is a heavy industry country, but 57% of all natural gas in Slovakia is consumed for heating buildings. That's 15 percentage points more than is consumed in industry. So this is where we need to focus if we want to, improve our energy security and independence from Russia.
And now we had an unfortunate period where energy prices were sky high. Was that a sufficient motivation for the households to think about the energy efficiency of the building? Because as you mentioned, maybe the period of the return on investment is relatively high, but it is more or less certain. So was there any changes in the behavior of Slovak households in this regard?
Indeed, indeed, and we saw it in the market. We saw a surge in interest. You know, people were inquiring, what could we do? Should we insulate the house? Should we replace windows? Should we install a heat pump? Should we install photovoltaics? We saw really a surge in the interest in what they could do, and I can also support this by the findings of a survey that we did before summer last year, where we basically asked, and it was a representative sample, so we asked the households how they expect the energy crisis and the increasing energy prices impact their own, household budget, and what if they plan to do anything about their energy consumption and what it is. And the findings were quite interesting, at least to me. But in hindsight, it was sort of expectable. So the high-income household said they did not expect much impact. They didn't expect to feel it very harshly, the increase of energy prices, and they were not planning to do any measures to decrease their consumption of energy. The poorest households, which was about 1/3 of the sample, said that yes, they will feel it, but they already have no measures to do, because they already have reduced their consumption to the bare minimum. There are many, and according to an even more recent survey, it's like 20% of single-family homeowners that they are not heating their homes to comfortable temperatures, or they are not heating the entire house, they are just heating part of it. So this 30% of the poorest households said, it's going to be harsh, but we have nothing to do. We cannot lower the temperature, and we don't have the money to invest, to insulate, or to replace windows. We don't have that, and we can't get a loan in the bank. Nobody is going to give us a loan. And then it was the middle ground, let's say, about 40% of the sample that said, yes, we will feel it quite noticeably on our budget, and 40% of the households were planning to do measures, either to change behavior, decrease the heating temperature, take shorter showers, whatever, or to invest in energy efficiency of the house. And what was surprising is that this middle ground were households even with 3 or 4 children, which was something that, on the other hand, the government was expecting that these households are the biggest risk. No, they were not. They were really prepared to do something, but the government would have to offer them sort of help to change from plans to action.
Okay, so you are saying that the government should help somehow. So what are the options for the public sector to help people to achieve those goals, either in terms of subsidizing some of the investments, or helping with the financing from private sources? So how do you see these options? What are the options for the government to help?
I think you have mentioned definitely some of them, and it's always a combination of each and every. I think what we need to make clear, and we have already some symbolism, especially when we are talking about the recovery and resilience plan. There are some good instruments, for example, for individual houses and units, that basically it's about a scheme that guarantees, after fulfilling all the requirements, that you are definitely getting, let's say, the subsidies, and you could benefit, let's say, from this kind of aid. Unfortunately, it's not valid for the public sector or public buildings per se. Also, the administration and the current EU structural funds are very inefficient in a way that basically if you are a public building owner, you are running basically a lottery, that you prepare all the preparations for the permitting, design phase, engineering, architects, and then you are not sure that you will be granted an aid or financial assistance. whereby on the individual houses now, if you meet certain standards, even though it's still very bureaucratic and the administration level is still comparable with the EU funds, it's still an avenue which needs to be explored in order to motivate and embark on this renovation wave by public buildings, that you basically set the scene in the following way. Once you meet those criteria, you are guaranteed in being successful and in having those grants. So this is also one of the greatest barriers, that you basically only one of 10 or one of 20 applicants will basically receive some fundings. And even though this funding is still not, it's far away from sustainability criteria. It's very simple measures. We're not talking about the very deep, complex renovation. We are really talking about the very minor upgrades, whereby I think we need to motivate and even provide more funding if the renovation of existing building goes beyond standard or goes much where we want those investments to go. And number two, you need certain guarantee. Once you meet them, you are definitely rewarded for that. So that's one of the barriers. And when you asked about other incentives, I think it's much wider discussion, definitely around the tax regimes for upgraded or retrofitted buildings. You could be sort of, you could have a reduced property tax, or you could have a different systems, and it's especially for the private sector, that they would be actually extra motivated to go for sustainable reconstructions or retrofit, because this is the only way how we can do it. For example, in Slovakia we have around or something more than 1 million individual houses and around 1,100,000 block of flats. For the individual houses, the scheme I was talking about covers roughly 30,000 of those houses. Let's say one third of them, one third of the million is somewhat, you know, standardized to the needs of 21st century. At least two thirds are basically in the 60s, 70s. So what we need to do, create a robust scheme that not only 30,000 would benefit, but let's say 300,000, so tenfold times. And number two, you need to also cater the most vulnerable, and it's the energy poverty and the debate we had earlier today, where you need to make sure that for at least one third of our population, you need to prepare a special social programs that even public authority could contribute to the energy bills, because they cannot afford basically changing from wood to gas, not talking about the full reconstruction. So I think you need to be more specific about which objects we are talking about, and be smart in using effective policies, not always in terms of subsidies, providing money, but basically try to motivate them, and if they're not meeting those standards, then they will pay extra money perhaps.
Are there any good examples from other European countries who managed this transition quickly, or this is something which is really very slow in many of the post-communist countries?
I think we are in the same shoes all over Europe. Of course, we have differences, different starting points, but I think the Central Eastern European region has some specificities, especially during the communist era. I think many of the building blocks were built around the same time, so this is the time, this is a decade when you need to upgrade those buildings. So I think we have a great low-hanging fruit, so to say, not only reducing our energy bills, but also meeting climate objectives in investing in those upgrades. So I think in different parts of the world, the situation is different. But I think also European Union, through the Green Deals and the renovation wave and other flagship initiatives, is going down that route, because it's about the modernization, it's about the investments, it's about promoting local economy and creating jobs and new types of jobs that will stay in the local economy. So I think it's a very smart decision to invest into the buildings.
So we talked a lot about households, but what about the firms and the corporate sector? Are they aware of that problem? Are they trying to somehow renovate their buildings, or they are at the same situation as households in general?
That's a good question. I think they are slightly in slightly different situation in that they are used to, use professional services. So they may not have that kind of, especially the larger companies. They may not have that kind of big lack of capacity to do the renovation. If you look at the office market in Slovakia, it's mostly about new buildings, and we see all older office buildings being refurbished and remodeled into apartments because the housing market is lacking apartments. So we see a lot of new buildings in the office market, which are already high in terms of energy efficiency. So that's a little bit different situation, but maybe if I can say a few words to and second what Norbert said about that we are in the same shoes across European member states. That yes, I agree, and it's difficult to say where are the good examples, but I would say two factors play a role. There are two success factors. First of all, it's a long-term programs. Not on and off programs like the European structural funds that we are using here in Eastern Europe, but really long-term programs, because if you want to renovate a building, even the preparation phase is very long. It can take 1 or 2 years. So you need to have a predictability, and you need to trust that when you are ready with your renovation, that the subsidy program will be there in 2 years. If you don't have that kind of, predictability, then you are going into a large risk preparing the renovation, and then when you are ready, the subsidies have run out. So if you look at German KfW, the development bank, I mean, it's running its programs for decades. The Czech program, green savings or new green savings, which is, by the way, financed from the revenues from the emission trading system, has been in place for 10 years, and its uptake, it's like 8,000 applications per year. So you can see that, but there was a curve, I mean, at the beginning it wasn't so successful. The first year, the second year, it needed some time, but now the predictability is really, creating the pipeline of projects and a good uptake. So the long-term programs is one thing, and the other thing is the technical assistance. Centers that are geographically well spread, accessible by people and public institutions, so that the centers, the technical assistance centers, can help the building owners prepare the renovation and go through the process. Also, here in Slovakia, we have some good experience. The Slovak Innovation and Energy Agency is running 4 or 5 centers for years. Now within this single-family home program, there are 10 more centers being developed or established, which is already helping. They say they had 16,000 inquiries over the last 4 months, which shows the interest as well. And there are also quite nice experience with energy communities in the region of Polana. An NGO was doing a very nice project where they basically facilitating a process of cooperation within village and among villages to create an energy community, provide the energy, the fuel, and decreasing energy consumption and creating some sustainable solution to the energy needs of the region.
I want to pick up on this element. What is the good role model for, let's say, also for private sector, and what actually arises from the international experience, even in our neighborhood, Czech Republic was mentioned. It's the energy performance contracting, that you basically, as a company, you have someone who will refit your operations in line and in fully compatible with the, let's say, climate neutrality or some CO2 objectives, and you get a very long-term contract for, let's say, 15 years, and for the savings you reach through the upgrades of the technologies, you will pay for the investments. So basically, this is a very working example how you can reduce emissions, how you can invest and use also innovative financial instruments to do that. So perhaps this is also an area, and paradoxically, it does not really work in Slovakia for the time being. I think there's less interest that was anticipated, but it's still a very viable model, especially maybe for private actors, for the industry, heavy industry, polluting industry. They can do the upgrades and actually let the investments paid by the savings.
Just a small comment. I think the energy performance contracting works quite well in Slovakia in the private sector. Where it doesn't work is the public sector. And the reason, especially in public buildings, is that the owners of the public buildings have opportunity to receive a subsidy of 90 or 95% from the European Structural and Investment Fund. Now, if you as a building owner have this kind of opportunity, you would be insane to not take it and go the performance contracting way and pay back the investment. So again, policy standing in a way of development of some kind of private service that is bringing guarantees of saving to you.
And I'm also interested in the angle of municipalities, because these are not the central government nor the private sector, but there are also huge needs for renovation. Something can be done with European funds. Something can be done also with these EPC contracts. But still, a lot of municipalities are complaining that they do not have enough finances to carry out the renovations. So, what are the biggest problems there at the municipal level? Is it really the financing problem, or even human resource capacities that they do not know what to do not know how to apply for funds? So how do you see that layer of government in Slovakia?
If I may, just again, the mixture of many you mentioned, it's definitely the human scarcity in terms of all the crises in recent years. It's only the permanent crisis regimes. Now with some political influence and flows, there was also huge reductions on the budget sides, and they don't know how to operate the usual operations, not sort of investment projects. So I think the situation is quite critical, and that's why it must be also again perhaps the greater or the better design of accessing, let's say, the EU funds, which at the moment it's too complicated, too administratively burdened, and does not basically bring any results. It's again sort of a lottery, and they need to invest again upfront a huge amount of money into the planning, designing phase, but then they have no certainty that this project will be funded. But speaking more widely, not only about the municipality, perhaps this is the project I was speaking about, Presidential Green Seal, that we want actually those public buildings owners to green themselves and make let's say more let's say greener operations. Unfortunately, we also don't have any extra money. But we have a regime, a mechanism, a system, how they can achieve that. But what is also very much needed when we talk about the state sector or public buildings as per se, we have at least 15,000 those buildings, and we need proper passportation. Probably not every building should be renovated. Many of them, they need a renovation, but it's not 100% they need renovation. So we need to make also a strategic roadmap, which of the buildings are to be renovated and which not. So this is also an homework for municipalities, because they have also schools, hospitals, senior houses, and they need to make, they cannot renovate at once and everything, so they also need a strategy which buildings is perhaps better fitted and prepared for those investments. So I think it's a combination of many factors.
I wanted to, if I may, I wanted to exactly mention this, that many municipalities don't even have the inventory of their buildings. And that's not their fault. I mean, they were not pushed, it wasn't necessary before. And many now are doing their best to create the inventory. Prešov self-governing region is using the funds from ELENA to do this inventory. Yet there are many municipalities that are trying to do that, and they face a lot of challenges. For instance, okay, they can map what buildings they have, but then they face the issue how to get to the information about the energy consumption in those buildings, because the buildings may not have the meters. So for instance, in a school building, you will have a hard time to distinguish how much gas has been used for cooking the lunch and how much gas has been used for heating. You need to continue cooking the lunches, but you can decrease consumption for heating. Or they struggle to get the information about their data and about the energy consumption from the providers of the energy. So that's kind of the struggles that they have, and we are promoting some improvement, some legislative regulatory improvements, but also some investment support to the new Repower EU chapter of the recovery plan, because we think that if we start metering more and better, then the municipalities, the public owners, the public building owners will have better information to base their decisions upon. And secondly, if we help them with these inventories, this will help them also make better decisions about investment.
We got some questions through Slido, so thank you for those. And if you still have one, you can send it. And the first one is related to basics and not policies. So how can you actually say that the new buildings are CO2 neutral if those are built from concrete, steel, and glass? So why are you saying that?
Yeah, I'm not saying that new buildings are carbon neutral. I'm not saying that, but they are very, very efficient already. And the carbon emissions of a building come from the operation and are also built in the building, in the materials, in the technologies, and everything we have in the buildings. And up until now, the effort was focused on cutting down the operational emissions, the heating, the hot water preparation, the lighting and air condition, ventilation, and all these purposes where energy is used. Because there was so much space, so much wasting energy, that the focus was right to focus on the operational energy. Once the buildings are top-notch in operational efficiency, we need to start looking at the embedded carbon, which is in the bricks, in the insulation, in the concrete, in the steel that is used to build buildings. And that is now beginning. The European Union is beginning to do that, but there is this is completely new area, and we will need to spend next 5 or 10 years to collect data, analyze them, and only then we will, as Europe, be able to define some benchmarks and requirements.
Okay. Another interesting question is that what can households expect once the ETS system is extended to buildings? Which is an interesting question. How is it possible to extend the ETS system also to include buildings, not only companies?
I think that's already happening, right? The European Union had agreed that they will include buildings in the ETS system. This will be focused on buildings that, today some of the buildings are already part of the ETS system, those that are supplied from district heating systems. So it is not fair that the other buildings are not part of the ETS system, and they are also not motivated to decrease the emission. This is already happening. There is, of course, some further negotiations ahead of us before we can say how this will look. I think member states will have a lot of say to decide how this will be implemented and applied in, country by country. And at the same time, the money that will come as revenues from these ETS for buildings will flow mostly to the Social Climate Fund, which will help to compensate the additional cost to households that are the poorest and that they cannot afford to invest. And we hope that the Social Climate Fund in Slovakia and in all countries, by the way, will not be only used to compensate for energy prices, but also to support renovation of buildings, because this is the only sustainable solution also for the poorest households.
Maybe also to clarify, so this negotiation is still in progress, so it's not agreed. Extension of EU ETS is also meant for the buildings and also for the transport, for passengers' cars. Even though it's also fair to say that from the perspective from Slovakia as, let's say, lower income member states, it's not very favorable because the purchasing power is lower. So I think it won't be very advantageous for Slovakia to pay for pollution as being part of the scheme. But on the other hand, there is also enough and robust tools to compensate energy poverty and help the most vulnerable. But what I wanted to say with that I think a word on the future of the buildings and on the private front itself. We have international standards and certifications like BREEAM, LEED, where you actually need to meet very strict criteria if you want to declare that your building is net zero or climate neutral. You really need to meet the highest standards. So many private owners, for example, one of the good examples is the shopping mall from HB Reavis, which has received the highest platinum standard even for community. So they are making, they are not even meeting the strictest, let's say, standards. So they were granted the high certification standard, but they were also making an impact on the community. So those are the good examples and sort of inspirations that they could be followed also in Slovakia.
And a follow-up question on that what kind of offsetting projects can you have let's say, in a concrete example of the presidential office, how to offset those emissions which are, already embedded in the building somewhere. So what kind of projects are you thinking about? Yeah.
So first of all, we have prepared, with the help of experts, a simplified certification scheme that is very much suited for the public sector. So it's not the full-scale criterions and the elements that you have normally in the standardized certification schemes. But coming to an example, we have worked also on special energy audit. So this dimension, we are again working also in the Presidential Palace with data, information, and actually based on the economic, energy and climate criterions, we have drawn 13 measures that we are going to implement over the next years to be net zero by 2030. So again, the data and evidence. But coming to the question and why the presidential scheme and why the project is credible, because those offsetting is actually officially acknowledged. For example, the presidential office emits roughly 1,600 tons per year, out of which 2/3 comes from the air travel. So around 1,000 emissions per year comes from the air travel. So we can effectively compensate and offset in order to avoid greenwashing those 2/3 of our total carbon footprint. And Carbon Calculator told us that we need to plant 1,300 300 trees annually to compensate those two-thirds of air travel emissions. So it brings me that it's kind of an activity that we go and plant trees with colleagues from the presidential palace. It's a kind of a team-building activity. Also, Madam President plants trees. And we go normally in April or October, and we literally plant, last time we planted 1,800 trees. There is a methodology how it is accounted for, and we actually, based on the data and figures, we know how much we need to do to offset, for example.
You would like to add something?
Yeah, this is a very nice example, and I just want to say an example from a different perspective. A building, let's say a school building in a city, may have a heat pump installed, or heat pumps, set of heat pumps. But as you know, schools are normally operated in the morning hours and during work days, but in the afternoons, overnight, and on the weekends, not to speak about holidays, the heat pump can still be working, but the energy produced is not necessary in the building. So if this building is providing the energy to surrounding buildings, such as apartment buildings, this is going to be a big benefit for the owners of the apartments, and at the same time, the school building will be offsetting its carbon emissions by, supplying the extra energy to others. So it's not, this is a very, very nice example. I very much like it, but I just wanted to say that there are also other ways how to offset the carbon emissions when it comes to buildings.
And what is also important that when you say offsetting, it's not that you just go and plant tree wherever you want. Normally, it's also in terms of a climate adaptation perspective, you need to plant those trees where they are really needed. So normally we go to the municipalities, to the areas where into the cities, villages, to the yards, not just to plant anywhere, but really they are adding value for water retention and so on.
But now I understand, what our grandparents used to say, that there was a famous saying in Slovakia that build a house, plant a tree, and have a son. So the first two were related to the climate change, that if you build a house and have a big emissions with that, you need to plant a tree to offset those. Okay, but let's...
Does the sun play with it?
Yeah, the sun can help with the building.
With watering the tree.
Okay, so we still have time for the last question from the audience. And this is related to an offsetting mechanism, which is that why don't we have regulation for green roofs for big buildings such as logistics centers and so on. So if it is good to offset, why don't we have a regulation for that?
I don't know why we don't have it. We have some technical standards that help the builders and the designers to prepare and to apply green roofs. It is also the demand for green roofs is growing, so the private investors are more and more interested to do it. Many cities are already having the climate adaptation plans, and green roofs and green walls on buildings are an integral part of those strategies. And so this is growing. What I like from abroad when it comes to policy, and when it comes to policy related to green roofs, is that buildings with green roofs have some kind of deduction on the water, rainwater fees, because of course the green roof is retaining part of the rainwater and not making demand to the drainage. So this is kind of also the economic, motivation for the building owner to install the green roof. And I like it. It's very, very simple and very straightforward.
And on top of it, for example, each square meter accounts for 5 kilograms of CO2 as absorption. And of course, it's a very good insulation material, so you need to cool less and heat less. So there's also economic motivation. For example, at one of the palaces, we have already installed the green roof. But of course, in ideal world, it would be very nice if there's a certain trajectory or some sort of even support through different practices, how to make it work.
Okay, so Norbert, Peter, thank you for your participation, and thank you also for the questions for this panel. Thank you.
As well.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Slovakia for chairing this panel discussion. Once again, and it's for the last time at this conference, we have a little break for you, probably like 45 minutes, and then we will discuss a very important topic that we will be, and we already mentioned here throughout the day, and it's the topic of energy supply. We've already mentioned some of the panelists who are here today with us, so please come back in 45 minutes and we will have a last panel discussion ready for you. Thank you very much for your attention.